Hey everyone, Nick Marzinski here at TrappingLight.com. In my last Lightroom tutorial, I discussed the tone section of the basic panel, which is these 6 sliders right here. Okay, and this is the area of the Develop module in Lightroom where we set up our black and white points and determine our exposure and our major contrast. After all of that has been dialed in, it's time to start working with minor contrast and color. And Lightroom gives us 3 sliders here in this present section of the basic panel that are completely devoted to that. So here I am in the Develop module in Lightroom. I'm in the basic panel, which is this very first panel right here, and now I'm going to be working with the present sliders, which are right here. And I'm going to go through them pretty much in order. This first slider here, called Clarity, is basically a mid-tone contrast slider. So it's more limited than the contrast slider up here above it. Okay, and here's an example. In this image, I'm going to make a clarity adjustment. And while I'm making that adjustment, I want you to look up here at the histogram. Okay, and as you can see, when I increase the clarity, the mid-tone section of the histogram really spreads out like okay? And that's really where this clarity is acting on. If I go to contrast up here, and when I increase that, you can see that I still get histogram movement in the midtones. However, I also get some movement in the whites and in the blacks of the histogram that I don't get with the contrast slider. And really where I want you to look is I want you to look at this blue section right here and watch what it does as I boost the contrast. I'm boosting the contrast and you can see that it spikes. Okay? In the clarity slider, when I do that, you don't get that same spike over here like you did before. Okay, and because clarity focuses specifically on the midtones, it's going to just spread out those midtones, and because it focuses specifically there, it's really good at teasing out little details in an image, and so it's really kind of a micro contrast adjustment. So when you move the slider here to the right, the image gets punchier and it gets more the detail becomes more accentuated. If you drag it all the way over, you get this kind of hyper real, gritty HDR effect going on. However, if you move the clarity slider to the left, the opposite happens. Mid-tone contrast decreases. You can see that in the histogram up here. And the image becomes softer, becomes very, very diffuse. Okay, and to get it back to 0, as with any of the sliders in Lightroom, you just double click on the name and it takes it right back to 0. So, fine, that's what clarity is, and that's all well and good, but when should you use it? And the answer to that question, and this is pretty much the answer to most of the questions that you raise in photography, is that it really depends on what you're shooting. With clarity, the subject matter should dictate your edits, and there's some subjects that do better with added clarity than others. So in this case, with these flowers here, I'm going to boost the clarity quite a bit because I'd like to accentuate the petals and the detail that you've got in the petals, and as well as the detail in the center of the flower here. So I really kind of want to accentuate that. The problem, of course, is that this flower is supposed to be out of focus, and it gives it more detail. And so while I'm increasing the clarity here and I'm liking what I'm seeing, I don't necessarily want to do it there. To get away from that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my adjustment brush here, dial down the clarity, and then just simply paint over this here to take my clarity adjustment that I've made to the rest of the image and to this other flower here out. So that gives me the best of both worlds. I get a very clear flower here, however I don't have that clarity adjustment being applied to the flower on the other side. Okay, so that's one image. Let's look at another image. Now in this case, this is one where it's a portrait of my daughter, and I don't really, I want it to have that kind of nice soft feel. If I boost the clarity, you can see what happens. So when you're dealing with portraiture, particularly of kids or women, and you boost the clarity like this, the shadows on her face become more pronounced, and she gets this gritty, crunchy look, which isn't very flattering, okay? So in this case, when I'm looking at this image, I'm actually going to almost take the clarity down just a little bit, just to kind of soften the image up. And then if I want to come back and introduce additional clarity, I'll do that with an adjustment brush on something like, for example, the fence here that she's standing against, or perhaps her clothes. However, that doesn't mean that every portrait doesn't benefit from additional clarity. Here's another portrait of my daughter. Same daughter, okay? But this image was intentionally shot to give it kind of a darker sort of feel. So I've stripped a lot of the color out of this image. There's very little color that's going on besides the scroll of her violin here. And if I increase the clarity here, it gives it this edgier, punchier look that I'm actually pretty happy with. And so clarity can also work in portraits. And think of, you know, a gritty portrait of an athlete, like those Gatorade commercials, for example. Those would benefit from a high clarity adjustment because you want to get that grittier nature in there. Okay, but for softer portraits, things like wedding portraits, things like, you know, senior portraits, where you don't want that gritty edge, adding additional clarity may not be what you want to do. And in fact, you may want to actually pull some of the clarity out. So that's portraiture. What about something like this, like architecture? Architecture, generally, boosting the clarity works real well. So if I boost the clarity here, I get a much more interesting and dynamic image than when I had it set to 0. So architecture benefits from boosting the clarity. As a matter of fact, you can really boost the clarity very, very high on architecture, and it will work well. Ditto for something where you just want to accentuate detail. In this case, this is a picture that I took of some rocks, and boosting the clarity really brings out all of this interesting detail that's going on the rock. So grabbing that clarity and teasing it out of the image, that mid-tone stuff, and teasing it out of the image is really great. And I don't necessarily get the same thing when I'm pulling on the contrast slider, because it tends to darken some of the areas up here, and it gives me this look that I'm not real happy with. So boosting the details with the clarity slider works real well because it doesn't affect these edges of the histogram as much as the contrast slider does. So that's clarity. Moving right along, after that we come to vibrance. Now, vibrance along with the saturation slider are both used to control the intensity of your colors, but they do so in very importantly different ways. The saturation slider here on the bottom works by changing the color intensity of all of the colors in your image, regardless of how intense they are. So it's really kind of a dumb slider. It's really kind of one that just acts on everything and says, okay, I'm going to either make you more saturated or I'm going to make you less saturated. So in this image of the flower here, if I drag up the saturation, it's going to affect everything. It's just going to grab everything and drag it over and make it really saturated on the right side and completely unsaturated, basically a black and white image on the left. Vibrance, on the other hand, is kind of more selective. It boosts the intensity of colors that aren't very intense already. Okay, and in addition to just boosting those colors, it also attempts not to do very much to skin tones. Okay, so in this image here, boosting the saturation all the way up just made this pink really get electric as well as these greens. If I take it back and I boost the vibrance instead, you'll notice that, yeah, things still get to be kind of hot and crazy, but what it's really doing is it's acting on colors that are not very vibrant already. Take a look at this blue section down here on the bottom corner, and that really is getting the effect of the vibrance adjustment because it's not very blue to begin with, but now that I'm boosting it, it's really boosting the blues, and the rest of this image doesn't get quite as electric as it did with the saturation slider. In addition, you have other elements of the flower, such as the tops up here, which aren't very pink, are less pink than the center sections, that when you start to increase this, those are the ones that fill in with color. These edges here, which have less color than the middle of the petals here, fill up with color first. And so it's a much more selective adjustment. You can kind of think of vibrance kind of like the color version of the shadow slider here. Okay, the shadow slider, if you move this from left to right, what it does is it really only acts on the darker portions of the image. So it brightens or darkens only those darker portions of an image. Vibrance works the same way. It really works its saturation magic on the duller colors of an image. And because it's so selective and it doesn't tend to make people look jaundiced, I'll use my daughter as an example here. If I increase the vibrance, her skin tones look a little crazy but not too bad. But if I drag up the saturation, then she really gets this kind of orange liver disease look to her, and that's not what I want at all. So in portraits and because it's more selective, I really actually like to use the vibrance slider more than the saturation slider. Frankly, in most of my images, I don't touch the saturation slider at all. I leave it set to 0, and I make all of my saturation changes to the image by using the vibrance, because the vibrance works really, really well at not making your colors look crazy. So I get good coloring here in the green, in the trees, and in her dress, and in her sweater, without really hurting her skin tones. And that's what I want by using this vibrance slider, which is a degree of control that I don't get from saturation. So when do you want to use saturation? Well, there's a really good example of that, which is right here. So here I've got some clouds, and they benefit from a clarity adjustment. They kind of make everything look interesting, but there's really not, the colors are kind of muted in these clouds here. And you would think, okay, well, the colors are kind of drabbed and dull, so vibrance should really do its magic. And if I take vibrance all the way up, it certainly acts on these drab colors in the sky that was pretty, I mean, it's blue, but it wasn't very blue. But it gives it really kind of an electric color, okay? And that's because it's really torquing on these colors and making them become more saturated. And you can go overboard with vibrance. When you have something where all of the colors, where it's fairly uniformly bland in terms of colors, and you want to punch those colors up, in this case I found that actually increasing the saturation here, and now it's all the way up at 100, gives me a much more pleasing image than increasing the vibrance. But again, that's in a case where the image is dull in terms of colors anyways across the board. Okay, so if the colors are dull and drab everywhere in the image, then I would actually recommend using a saturation boost. However, if you want to just punch up your image where you've got good colors or you've got skin tones, in that case, then vibrance is going to want to be the slider that you're going to want to use. So if I was going to do a real quick work on an image, you can see how I would now introduce the present stuff. So going back to this image, I haven't really made any adjustments to the tone here. Okay, I've gone to camera calibration. I've already decided that my camera portrait looks okay. We'll go with camera portrait. Go up to basic here at this point. Like I said in previous tutorials, I'm going to find my white point and black point after dialing in that, which actually kind of preferred the way it was before. Go through here and see. Auto doesn't look too bad. Now I'm starting to get a lot of yellow in the building, which I don't like. Tungsten looks absolutely horrible. That looks too blue. Actually, flash looks okay. Maybe I'll just make it a little bit bluer. Okay, so set my white point, hold down the Alt key or the Option key, find where I get some white, just a little bit up at the top here. Set my black point, and generally with black points I'm willing to give it a little bit more of a push than I am with a white point. Boost my contrast a bit. The exposure looks okay, maybe I'll just boost it a little bit. And then recheck. There we go. It still looks okay, maybe give it a little bit more. My highlights, go up to there maybe, my shadows. Take my shadows down. Now I'm done with that. Now I'm going to my present stuff, and I'm going to boost the clarity. And in this case, I really kind of want to boost it. Shadows start to look a little crazy with the clarity boosted, so maybe I'll take those back a little bit. But I'm really boosting the clarity here. Vibrance gives me the yellow back. I'll boost that just a little bit. Saturation I shouldn't even need to touch, and you can see that saturation just takes the image way overboard. So just a quick example of how I'd quickly go about moving through everything that we've discussed so far, from camera calibration to white balance to tone to presence. This is what it looked like before. That's what it looks like after. And it's a much more interesting, much more dynamic image now with those edits in place. So that's it for now. Hope this video has given you a better understanding of how clarity and vibrance and saturation work in Lightroom. And that's it for the basic panel, which deals really with all of these global edits, from tone to white balance to clarity and contrast and saturation. In the next tutorial, I'm going to start moving into talking about how you can make more selective edits specifically to your colors in Lightroom using the hue, saturation, and lightness panel in Lightroom. And so that's really kind of a fun one to do because you can affect specific colors in very specific ways. Until then, have fun boosting the midtone contrast and undersaturated colors in your image if they need it. And as always, thanks for watching.